With new revelations emerging from the deep archives, Aelir's hard-won throne stands more precarious than ever. Rumors swirl that a hidden faction of Dracoths, still loyal to the fallen conspirator Lysandros, is plotting a coup to reclaim power. Unable to stand idly by, the recovering queen and her steadfast ally Kirin embark on a clandestine mission through the Empire's frontier outposts. Every new system they visit reveals subtle dangers: bribed governors, frightened civilians, and well-placed spies determined to sabotage Aelir's rule. Meanwhile, the alliance between human worlds and Dracoth territories teeters on the brink, balancing hope and uncertainty. Will they manage to uproot the last vestiges of conspiracy before it ignites a galactic civil war? Stay tuned to witness how bonds forged in hardship push both Queen and Engineer to face trials that will test their courage and convictions. Adventure and treachery await at every turn. Aelir was not born merely to command, she was born to conquer. From the moment she first tested her wings on the floating citadels of her home planet, Caradoth, it was clear that destiny had chosen her for greatness. At just 15 cycles, she tamed the beastly drakes rumored to devour foolish riders. By 20, her battlefield prowess had secured her a place in the Kolvari Empire's exalted war council. Now, at the height of her reign as Supreme Battle Queen, her throne extended across 13 systems, each bowing to her will. Yet power, as she often reminded her soldiers, was a precarious prize. It must be seized, protected, and, when necessary, defended with sharp claws. She had never once doubted her unstoppable ascent, not until the night the Imperial flagship Sunstrider's legacy shuddered beneath her feet, assaulted by unseen hands in a region of space marked as routine patrol coordinates. That fateful patrol began as calmly as any. Aelir sat in her command throne, scales reflecting the faint luminescence of the ship's overhead panels. Her bright silver gaze flicked to the star-studded view screens, scanning for anomalies. She had always preferred a direct presence on the bridge, finding that her imposing silhouette and regal posture reassured her Dracoth warrior crew. This was especially true on nights of eerie stillness, where the hush of space carried threats beyond the edges of well-charted trade routes. Beside her, First Officer Marox, a hulking Dracoth with russet scales, observed incoming sensor data with unwavering diligence. Swift, methodical, stoic. He had served her with unquestioning loyalty for nearly a decade. In the engineering deck several levels below, Kirin toiled in silent concentration. One of the very few humans aboard the Sunstrider's legacy, he lived in perpetual tension, made to bear the humiliations of the empire that had invaded and subjugated his kind. While most Dracoths treated him with a mixture of contempt and cold indifference, Kirin's brilliance in mechanical systems had proven too valuable to waste. If he noticed the sideways sneers of reptilian technicians or the sharpened barbs from the soldiers, he rarely let it show. Determination clung to him like a second skin. Even before his capture, he had spent years as the Resistance's chief engineer, designing defensive shields, analyzing Dracoth weapon signatures, and carving out precarious victories for the beleaguered human enclaves. None of that defiance had spared him from eventually becoming Aelir's prisoner when his Resistance corvette fell. 3 years into his enforced servitude, he had grown grimly accustomed to life under the Empire's scaly thumb. Not long into the patrol, the ominous wail of proximity alarms shattered the quiet. Kirin felt the starship lurch violently, pitching him forward onto the metal plating of the engine room. Sparks rained down from exposed cables, and the acrid scent of fried circuitry stung his nose. On the bridge, Aelir's silver eyes flashed as she witnessed the sensor display fill with red icons, 3 unidentified warships materializing from the edges of a swirling nebula. An ambush. The entire ship rocked under a barrage of plasma bursts. Seconds later, key systems were blinking offline. Determined not to show fear, the Battle Queen barked for a return volley. Her reptilian voice cut through the klaxons. "Target their engines, now!" As the first wave of enemy fire ripped into the Sunstrider's hull, Kirin scrambled to reroute power to the weapon batteries. Yet a chilling revelation struck him. The core was already nearing critical from previous damage. Divert more power, and the entire ship would risk meltdown. That was when an imperious voice crackled through the engineering bay speakers, commanding him to abandon all safety protocols. "By order of Queen Aelir," it snarled, "you will prioritize weapons output and main shields, immediately." Kirin's face contorted with frustration. He knew the Dracoths would never accept a human's counsel, but ignoring reactor safety spelled imminent doom. Torn by the raw threat of disobedience and the knowledge that the entire vessel was mere seconds from catastrophe, Kirin made a choice that would cost him dearly. Disobeying a direct Imperial command triggered an internal chain of events Kirin couldn't halt. While he stabilized the antimatter containment field, instead of redirecting more power to the cannons, the bridge descended into a frenzy of half-shouted orders and flashing alarms. Aelir herself stomped forward on splayed talons, addressing the first officer in a clipped, menacing tone. "Why has my directive not been carried out?" she hissed, voice rumbling through the ship's audio. Marox rechecked the battered console, scanning for an explanation. "Highness, the human has locked us out." His words turned each Dracoth head on the bridge. Outrage spiked, No lesser being should have such authority over their systems. Override him, Alir demanded, eyes blazing. Yet the sabotage was thorough. The security passcodes replaced with an emergency subroutine that Kieran had coded in desperation. The flagship reeled again, struck by concentrated enemy blasts that left gaping holes in vital sectors. A spasm of alarm flitted across Alir's regal face as the pilot stammered. Your Majesty, we're losing helm control. Within moments, this vessel's atmospheric sensors detected a gravitational pull. A planet's surface loomed below, a swirling sphere hidden behind the luminous glare of cosmic dust. They were being dragged into its orbit, too damaged to break free. The Queen's hands curled tightly around the arms of her throne, canning the chaos of explosions and smoke. All hands, she commanded, voice ringing out. Initiate evacuation. Get to the escape pods, now. Somewhere in the stuttering lights, a wide-eyed communications lieutenant coughed out a frantic message. The hull is compromised near the starboard docking ring. Structural collapse imminent. The path forward was dire. Even as the commanding officers rushed to gather essential gear, Alir broadcasted an all-ship message. Kieran, the human engineer, has overridden my orders, dooming this ship. Execute him on sight. Her pronouncement sealed Kieran's fate in the eyes of the Dracoth crew. Yet the engineer was far beyond hearing. He had locked down the engineering bay to buy himself time, stripping the ship's final power reserves to keep the reactor stable long enough for crash landing. Not a mid-battle meltdown. The impact would be brutal, but survivors could exist after a crash. No one survived an antimatter core going critical. As the Sunstrider's legacy trembled in its final descent, Kieran strapped himself into an emergency harness. He braced for the insane G-forces of atmospheric re-entry, the shrieking friction turning hull plates molten. With a sudden roar, the starship slammed into the unknown planet's atmosphere. Heat ravaged the upper decks. Entire compartments buckled. The vessel careened across the alien sky like a meteor of twisted metal. Upon impact, the world dissolved into fire and deafening thunder. Kieran lost consciousness within seconds, battered by tumbling wreckage and blistering heat. Above him, the ship split into multiple sections, scattering across a wide canyon of strange flora and shimmering rock. The last thought in his mind flickered ironically. He'd meant to keep them alive. Yet if the Dracoths reached him now, he'd face a fate worse than fire. When Kieran finally stirred in the battered remains of engineering, the stench of scorched metal and chemicals hung thick in the air. Gasping, he discovered he was pinned by the harness, dangling upside down. His hair, caked in dry blood, clung to his forehead. With a grunt of pain, he released the buckle, crashing onto the twisted ceiling, now serving as his floor. He coughed violently, drawing in short, acrid breaths. The control panels were dark, sparks occasionally dancing along ripped wires. No Dracoth curses or footsteps echoed in the passageways. He was alone in the wreckage, at least for now. If the remnants of the hull gave way, or if a fire flared, it could all be over in seconds. Yet a powerful sense of duty propelled him to check for survivors. Even as a prisoner of war, his conscience demanded he try to save those who might still be trapped in compartments beyond. Scrambling through twisted corridors and half-collapsed bulkheads, Kieran's practiced mind sorted through the chaos. Engineers by nature solve problems. Even cataclysmic wreckage was a puzzle. He dug through fallen beams for emergency kits, picking up scattered ration packs, canteens, and a functioning handheld scanner. His boots crunched over shattered glass panels, and the overhead lighting flickered weakly. The scanner indicated minimal life signs in the immediate radius, only a faint reading near the crashed remains of the ship's front section. Kieran hesitated, knowing that going there could be suicidal. If Dracoth soldiers had survived, they'd be searching for him, especially after Alir's broadcast ordering his execution. Still, the little blip on the scanner tugged at him. A single life sign might be a wounded colleague, or it could be a battered Dracoth hungry for revenge. One step at a time, he pushed out of the engine section into a bizarre alien daylight. The planet's sun, actually two suns he realized, was creeping over the horizon, bathing the crash site in ethereal shades of lavender. Surrounding him were strange, crystalline growths that twisted out of the ground like spirals of shimmering glass. They reflected rainbow arcs across the scorched hull fragments. In the sky, faint silhouettes of winged creatures circled, releasing shrill calls that prickled the nape of Kieran's neck. Each breath felt heavier, the atmospheric pressure higher than Earth's standard, though still breathable. He carried on, stepping over the remains of Dracoth bodies, the broken forms partly unrecognizable from the violent impact. Everywhere he looked, panels of jagged hull pieces were embedded in the ground like fallen tombstones. Eventually, he found what used to be the bridge lodged against a small cliff of purple rock. The nose section angled up, half buried. Smoke and sparks wafted from broken windows. Retrieving a length of twisted pipe for protection, Kieran approached cautiously. "Hello?" he called into the gloom. Only the hum of wind and the distant crackle of small fires replied. Stepping through the largest gap in the hull, he nearly tripped over a collapsed console. The scanner beeped, guiding him deeper. A muffled sound. Was it breathing or a pained groan? He shifted a spar of metal aside, revealing what looked like the swirl of regal Dracoth armor. His heart pounded. He'd found none other than Queen Elir, pinned beneath an enormous girder. For a moment, Kieran froze. She was his tormentor, after all, a monolithic figure of scaly authority who had personally ratified the subjugation of his species. Under that girder, the famed warrior queen looked pitiful and battered. Her normally glimmering scales were crusted with dark, nearly black blood. She spotted him in an instant, eyes narrowing. A bare hiss escaped her parted lips, showing rows of razor-edged fangs. Traitor, she spat through clenched teeth. Despite her predicament, menace still radiated from Aaron. Kieran felt his own breath catch. If he left her here, no one would ever know he'd had the opportunity. She was a living symbol of Dracoth dominance. He should simply walk away and let fate take its course. But he didn't. Instead, he slung his makeshift pipe aside and bent down to assess the twisted metal crushing her hips and legs. Her injuries were horrific, broken limbs obvious at a glance. A deeper worry was the possible spinal damage. If Dracoths were akin to humans in physiology, she might be permanently crippled. At the sound of him shifting the debris, she snapped, "What are you doing? Finish me if you dare." Kieran exhaled, ignoring her venom, whether it was some remnant of altruism or the ghost of his mother's final words urging compassion. He couldn't abandon a living being to die. "I'm going to help you," he said evenly, more to himself than to her. And Queen Elir, in that moment, could only stare in stupefaction. Using all his engineering experience, Kieran fashioned a rudimentary lever from the rubble. Each push lifted the beam a few painful inches. Through clenched teeth, Elir refused to whimper, though beads of sweat or perhaps some translucent excretion dotted her brow scales. Her pride resisted showing weakness before a human, even one trying to save her. After interminable straining, the girder rolled away, freeing her. At once, bright purple blood spilled from deep lacerations on her thighs. Kieran scrambled, cursing at the severity of it. A Dracoth queen was tough, but the damage was near fatal. Without immediate medical intervention, she could bleed out or succumb to shock in minutes. "Lie still," he ordered, checking the battered medkit strapped to his salvage belt. Strangely, she obeyed, although her eyes burned with suspicion. Her voice rasped, "You are a fool, or do you desire my favor in exchange for an impossible rescue?" She grimaced, coughing. Kieran pressed a coagulant patch to her worst wound. "Maybe I'm just not the monster you think we humans are," he replied, unzipping a makeshift bandage pack and wrapping her legs as best he could. A hiss escaped her lips, half agony, half frustration. "I don't need your pity," she spat between ragged breaths. But her ferocious glare began to dull, replaced by a haze of pain. In the hours that followed, Kieran dragged her clear of the shattered hull, inch by inch. The strange local sun continued its arc, revealing a rugged, hauntingly beautiful terrain. He scrounged a spot of relative shelter beneath a rocky overhang where the cliff's outcropping formed a natural canopy. With the methodical precision of a veteran survivor, he scavenged thermal blankets, extra hull plating, and anything else he could use to create a rudimentary camp. The Queen's condition stabilized, though her lower body remained alarmingly swollen and immobile. A Dracoth soldier's scales could mend superficial wounds quickly, but broken bones and severed nerves were another matter entirely. When Elir finally roused more fully, her eyes flickered in confusion at her predicament. Propped against a rock, bandaged by a human's hand. The collar that once bound Kieran's neck, a slaver's device that could deliver paralyzing shocks, was scorched and dead, destroyed in the crash. She was in no position to rectify that. Weakly, she tested her limbs, only to grimace at the pain lancing her spine. Dusk was fast approaching, the temperature dropping sharply. Kieran checked the meager supplies spread before him. Half a pack of nutritional wafers, a small purifier that could hopefully render the planet's water drinkable, and a single emergency heat lamp. He was ironically grateful that Dracoths, being cold-blooded in a sense, favored warmer temperatures. He could use body heat and blankets to keep her from hypothermia. "Don't suppose you have a plan," she muttered derisively. To her surprise, Kieran's expression was resolved. "I do. We figure out how to survive the night, then we check the rest of the wreck for better supplies at dawn." The Queen smirked humorlessly, then coughed. "Together." She spat that last word like it was poison. Kieran shrugged, distributing the minimal rations equally, one wafer for him, one for her. "We both want to live, don't we?" he replied calmly. It was a testament to the planetary twilight's chill, or perhaps the severity of her injuries, that the once invincible Queen nodded in silent concession. Nightfall brought a chorus of unsettling calls from the alien wilderness. Winged, bat-like creatures soared against the pale glow of two moons. From the darkness, howls and chitters echoed off the rocky walls. The temperature plummeted so drastically that condensation frosted over their makeshift shelter. Kieran inched nearer to Elir, bracing a reflective sheet behind them to trap heat from the emergency lamp. Her breathing turned shallow, but she refused to whine or speak of the pain creeping up her legs. Nevertheless, her scaly arms clutched the tattered edges of a heat-resistant tarp, trying to conserve warmth. At last, she glanced at Kieran through half-lidded eyes, evaluating him with a mix of wariness and curiosity. "You saved my life, and yet you claim no motive other than..." Altruism? She asked, voice hoarse. Kieran stared back at her. Call it refusing to let another being die when I can help it, he answered, carefully opening the purifier to see if it had gathered enough moisture for a tiny water reservoir. But you disobeyed me, sabotaged my command, crashed my flagship, Alir pointed out bitterly, her tail flicking in agitation. Kieran's jaw set. I kept the reactor from detonating. If I hadn't done what I did, we'd have vaporized in open space, not crashed here. We might still die, but at least there's a chance. The Queen shifted slightly, wincing at the motion, then released a short, mirthless laugh that ended in a coughing fit. You have courage, she admitted, and no small measure of skill. That I can't deny. Silence returned, marked by the rasp of Kieran's breath and the occasional hum of the damaged heat lamp. An hour or more passed as they huddled. Each was acutely aware of the precarious nature of their alliance. For Kieran, his memories of the Dracoth conquest of Earth burned within him. The incinerated cityscapes, the countless refugees, the endless nights of resistance that always ended in more funerals. Sitting here shoulder to shoulder with the very queen of that empire was surreal. For Alir, a swirl of conflicting emotions gnawed at her. She'd built her identity around Dracoth's superiority. Now, a mere human, one she had personally enslaved, was the reason she still drew breath. The dissonance unsettled her. As the night stretched on, the temperature dropped even further. Kieran recognized the early signs of hypothermia in the queen. Slow response, erratic shivering. Without letting her protest, he draped his jacket, lightly padded with thermal fibers, across her shoulders and adjusted the lamp to press its meager warmth closer to her scales. She allowed it, though the look in her eyes suggested her pride was smoldering. I would have killed you if I could, she said, not entirely coldly, but with a soft acknowledgement of truth. Kieran nodded grimly. I'm well aware, he muttered, hugging his arms to his chest. But right now, we need each other. By the time dawn's first rays tinted the horizon in lilac hues, neither had slept more than fragments of an hour. Yet each had learned a sliver of the other's perseverance. Both had endured unimaginable hardships, and both had reasons to hate. But on this unknown planet, with their mortal vulnerabilities laid bare, a fragile thread of collaboration emerged, the very thread that might decide both their fates. When dawn at last returned, a thin, pearly light filtering through the alien sky, Kieran roused himself from a half-doze to check on the wounded queen. Alir was still upright against the rock ledge, her scales dulled and caked with dried purple blood, but her breathing was steady. The improvised bandages he'd fashioned overnight needed a fresh change. Quietly, he retrieved the last of his antiseptic wipes from the small medkit. Even with minimal supplies, he was determined to do all he could to stave off infection. Their small campsite, tucked beneath the towering spire of carmine-hued stone, offered only partial protection from the swirling breezes of this strange planet. Already the local sun was climbing, casting lavender beams that illuminated an extensive ravine below. Pieces of the Sunstrider's legacy lay strewn across the valley floor like a dismantled puzzle. Some sections were still smoking, while others had become bizarre perches for the winged creatures that rose and fell in shrill-voiced flocks. Alir blinked awake as he carefully tugged away a soiled bandage from her thigh. Her lips twisted in a reflexive snarl, though she quickly wrestled down any outward sign of pain. Pride still coursed through her regal bearing, even when half-crippled. Don't get used to touching your queen, she growled. Yet Kieran noticed her tone lacked its previous hostility. It was more performative now, an echo of the intimidation she used to command unwavering obedience. Without answering, Kieran worked methodically, cleaning her lacerations, applying the meager salve that remained. In turn, Alir studied his face, the tense line of his jaw, the haunted flickers in his eyes. She could sense that his iron resolve was born from more than just human decency. She recognized the cynicism behind it too, the residue of someone who had seen too many tragedies. Yet even so, his actions betrayed a seed of empathy she found bewildering and inconveniently moving. A loud crash in the ravine startled them both. One of the scattered hull segments had collapsed, toppling into a lower crevasse. It reminded Kieran that if they hoped to survive, they needed resources, medical gear, a steady water supply, and perhaps some semblance of shelter from whatever predators roamed these crystalline expanses. Stay put, he told her, setting the bandages aside. He disliked the notion of leaving her alone, but had no choice if they wanted to salvage anything useful. I'll search the wreckage for more supplies. If you see or hear anything, shout or find a weapon. She huffed derisively, but there was a flicker of amusement in her eyes. I'm not a helpless hatchling. Go. But don't take forever. I've lost enough blood. Kieran nodded and hoisted his makeshift pack over one shoulder. Before stepping away, he pressed an emergency beacon button on his scanner, though it had barely enough power to produce a feeble signal, let alone broadcast off-world. He doubted any friend or foe could detect it, but he had to try. I'll return soon. Try not to die, he said softly. Alir's parting look was laced with cool skepticism. Hurry back, engineer, she replied, tilting her scaled chin. As he clambered down toward the valley of scattered debris, a peculiar thought struck him. She had used his title, engineer, instead of slave. Though slight, it was the first acknowledgement of him as something other than a lesser being. And in that small shift, an unspoken promise of change trembled between them. Navigating the crash site by daylight revealed the planet's harsh grandeur. In place of trees, crystalline spires jutted from the ground, bending light into dancing rainbows across the destroyed hull fragments. The ground itself was littered with chunks of blackened metal and cracked conduits. The acrid scent of charred electronics forced Kieran to cover his nose with a scrap of cloth. As he picked his way around a battered wing module, he discovered two Dracoth warriors, both dead, pinned beneath an overturned cargo loader. Their weapons lay just out of reach, half buried in the rocky ground. Despite a surge of grim memories, these Dracoths might have once threatened him. He paused to close their vacant, reptilian eyes. They deserved at least that small gesture of respect. He salvaged what rations and energy cartridges he could find in the pouches on their utility belts. The Dracoths, fiercely proud, traveled light. Nonetheless, the few items he claimed would prove invaluable: a partially intact stim spray, a micro-lantern, and 3 high-energy food bars. He tested their sealed packaging, relieved to see they hadn't been breached. Moving on, he located a splintered panel from the medical bay. Though most of the contents were gone, he did manage to retrieve a scanning wand that still had some battery left. Hoping it might offer deeper insight into Alir's injuries, he slipped it into his belt. A short distance away lay an upside-down escape pod, its entrance crumpled. Perhaps it had ejected moments before the ship fully impacted. Kieran tried to pry it open, but the metal was fused. Grunting, he resorted to a small plasma torch he found near the bodies. After what felt like an hour, the hatch creaked, enough to allow him to peer inside. The pod's emergency kit was missing, but he stumbled on a half-functional environment controller. It was battered, but if he could integrate the micro-lantern and some power cells, he might rig a temporary climate stabilizer, a lifesaver in this place of punishing temperature swings. He dragged the broken device out and stowed it with the other salvage. By midday, sweat darkened Kieran's shirt. He took a cautious sip of purified water from his flask and rechecked the sky, noticing dark cloud formations drifting in. Great, he thought. Whether they were thunderstorms or something more exotic, he'd soon find out. He had to get back to Alir. The queen was grievously injured, and the large gash running across her torso needed real medical attention, something more than disinfectant patches. He made good time returning, spurred on by the worry that she might have been discovered by roving predators. He heard them out there, low growls echoing between the crystalline spires, scuttling sounds behind ridges. By the time he reached the outcropping, he was panting, his pulse hammering. Relief flooded him when he saw Alir still propped against the rock, her slitted eyes flicking over his approach. "You took long enough," she remarked. Though her scales dulled further, her voice retained that stern, commanding cadence. "Did you come back with something worthwhile?" Kieran sank to his knees beside her. Food bars, a few meds, and a possible climate unit. He paused, noticing a new tension in her posture. "Did anything happen?" She nodded towards strange footprints in the dirt, elongated, with multiple claw marks. "We had a visitor sniffing around. I didn't get the best look, but it was large." She gave a tight grin. "Lucky for me, it was easily startled by movement. I just had to bang a rock against the hull plate." With the caution born of two survivors leaning on each other's strengths, Kieran began examining her wounds again. He used the scanning wand and let out a sharp breath, revealing dangerously low internal temperature and a precarious spinal bruise near her tail. "Not great," he murmured, "but you're stable for now." Her eyes closed briefly, weariness etched on her regal features. The faintest rumble of thunder made the ground vibrate. Kieran looked at the looming storm clouds. "We need to move. If it rains acid or something equally nasty, I don't want us caught in the open." Alir regarded the swirling sky, then slowly raised her arm. "Help me stand. I refuse to be carried like a broken hatchling." There was no jest in her voice. Despite her fierce protest, her weight eventually sagged against him, scales scraping the rough folds of his jacket. "If you drop me," she warned breathlessly, "I'll kill you." Kieran mustered a wry grin. "Kill me after we survive, Your Majesty." Under the growing shadows of rolling storm clouds, they half walked, half stumbled through the labyrinth of stone spires. Alir's strength gave out in intervals, forcing Kieran to support the majority of her weight. She wavered, tail dragging behind in the dust. Each step sent fresh waves of pain across her bruised spine. Still, she never cried out, channeling every ounce of her formidable will into moving forward. When at last they found a recess in the towering rock face, Kieran angled the battered environment controller inside. The recess wasn't much, more a pocket in the cliff than a true cave, but it offered some defense against wind and rain. Once he got the rig powered with the micro-lantern and an extra battery cell, the contraption hissed softly to life, generating a faint barrier of stable temperature. The air seemed marginally warmer, enough for them to brace against the sudden chill as the storm crashed overhead. Alir sank onto an improvised bedding of scrap fabric. She watched Kieran rummage through the items he'd salvaged, methodically transforming them into a miniature stronghold. He used hull plating to cover the open side of the recess, weighed down with stones to keep it from blowing away. He set up the purifier near the entrance, hoping to catch some rainwater. Within minutes, the planet's weather unleashed a fury of howling winds and sheets of silver rainfall, pounding the cliff face and making the improvised plating rattle. Lightning danced across the sky, illuminating Elir's strained expression. Kieran paused in his frantic work. He could see the lines of agony etched into her features, the trembling in her forearms when she tried to shift positions. The queen seemed reluctant to speak of her pain, perhaps clinging to the Dracoth code of stoic valor. Still, he caught her exhaling shakily when she thought he wasn't looking. Digging into his pocket, he produced the stim spray he'd lifted from the dead soldier earlier. He had verified it wasn't dangerously specialized for reptilian biology, like certain Dracoth steroids might be. This was a broad-spectrum pain reliever. He pressed it lightly against her scaled arm. "Take this," he said. She eyed the device, her gaze flicking from it to his face. "You'd use our own medicines on me? How touching." The words carried a note of dry humor, but her posture betrayed relief. She allowed him to inject the medication, which quickly eased the tension in her shoulders. Minutes later, thunder roared. The storm hammered the exterior plating with relentless force. With no immediate task left, Kieran settled down opposite Alir. Their small thermal field whirred softly, cutting through the stifling wind. For a time, neither spoke. The hush was only broken by the crackle of overhead lightning and the dripping water that gathered in the purifier. They were two adversaries thrust into an uneasy companionship, forced together by survival. Eventually, Alir broke the silence. "Our empire believed humans too fragile to endure extreme conditions." She lifted her gaze to his. "Yet you adapt quickly." Kieran studied the storm-lashed darkness beyond the plating. Humans survived countless disasters on Earth. Wars, famine, environmental collapse, long before you Dracoths arrived. He managed a bitter smile. "We've had too much practice." Alir digested that quietly. Another jagged bolt of lightning revealed the conflicted expression on her regal features. In its electric flash, they both realized how precarious this alliance was, how fragile the bond between them, built on necessity rather than trust. Still, necessity itself could become the first step towards something more. By the time the storm passed, evening had returned. Dim starlight flickered through gaps in the dark clouds. Exhaustion weighed on them both, but rest was fleeting. Kieran awoke sometime in the night to the sound of a low, predatory growl, like stones grinding together in a deep echo. Tensing, he reached for the Dracoth sidearm he'd recovered from the wreck. Though its power cell was nearly depleted, Alir's eyes snapped open as well. In the faint glow of the environment controller's dial, they saw a silhouette move outside their makeshift barrier. The plating rattled again, this time from something pushing rather than wind. Kieran's pulse thundered. He pictured the footprints Alir had shown him earlier, the six-toed pattern that hinted at a hulking form. Without a word, the queen exchanged a grim look with him, a silent vow to fight if they must. Slowly, carefully, Kieran rose to brace his shoulder against the plating, weapon aimed. Another push came, harder now, bending the slab inward. A savage, guttural hiss resonated from just beyond it. The environment controller flickered under the strain, its meager power never designed to handle sudden shocks. "If it breaks through," Alir murmured, voice taut with suppressed fear, "we kill it or we die." On a whispered count of 3, Kieran shoved the plating forward while firing a single bolt from the sidearm. Bright green energy seared through the darkness, accompanied by a piercing screech. For an instant, the creature reared back, a shape of spined limbs and elongated jaws. It twisted away with unnatural quickness, leaving an acrid stench and strange luminous droplets behind. Kieran withdrew back into the recess, hard hammering. He hoped the shot had driven it off. Still panting, he turned to check Alir. She had levered herself to a sitting position, a jagged scrap of metal clutched in her claws. The queen looked both furious and shaken. "You okay?" he asked, kneeling by her side. She grimaced. "Yes," she managed, "but that thing will likely return. A fleeting wound won't stop it for long." She closed her eyes as if summoning her old strategic mindset. With the barrier dented and their precious power cell nearly drained, it became clear they had to relocate somewhere more secure. "We need better shelter," Kieran said, running a hand through his sweat-streaked hair. "Preferably near water, but defensible." Alir flexed her tail in agitation. "Perhaps the cliffs west of here. I spied them from the bridge before we crashed. They rose high and looked riddled with natural caverns." So it was decided. As soon as daylight returned, they'd gather what they could and venture toward those distant heights. Once more, Alir insisted on walking, though every step worsened her limp. She fought tooth and claw not to lean on Kieran more than absolutely necessary. Stubbornness and pride were etched into her scales. Kieran recognized it was how she shielded herself from the humiliation of relying on a human servant. Meanwhile, an unspoken tension simmered between them, born from close encounters and shared vulnerability. Each time Kieran steadied her when she nearly fell, each time her taloned hand gripped his shoulder, an odd warmth passed through them. Neither was ready to name it or accept it. They lived breath to breath, threatened on all sides. Yet in that midnight hush, with the creature's shrieks echoing through the valley, Alir and Kieran found themselves pressed close, hearts pounding in parallel. They set out at first light, forging a slow path over jagged ground. Alir stifled a groan whenever a sharp rock jabbed her injured legs, but when Kieran glanced over in concern, she offered only a tight-lipped nod. Beyond them stretched a wilderness of crystalline arches and hazardous gullies. Twice they had to detour around yawning chasms whose depths glowed with mysterious bioluminescence. Spidery vines dangled from the edges, dripping neon fluid into the swirling gloom below. No chance of crossings there. After hours of incremental progress, the looming shape of a rocky escarpment appeared. It rose from the shimmering forest floor like a fortress wall. Towering spires of stone merged into a single massive ridge, punctured by pockets that might be caves or monstrous dens. Kieran spotted a narrow trail zigzagging up the face, likely carved by erosion or water flow. "That's our best shot," he said, wiping his brow. "It's steep, but it might lead to a more defensible spot." Eilir took in the formidable ascent with an assessing eye. "If we can't find a suitable cavern at ground level, yes, but climbing that slope with my injuries isn't guaranteed." There was no complaint in her tone, only a cool reading of the facts. Not far along the ridge's base, they discovered a partially collapsed cavern entrance. Petrified vines twisted across its threshold like arthritic fingers. "One way to find out," Kieran said, stepping carefully through. The interior was dim, lit only by slivers of daylight filtering through cracks in the rock. The air felt stale, but at least it wasn't brutally cold. More importantly, it was spacious enough for them to stand and relatively free of anything that resembled a nesting predator. By unspoken agreement, they got to work. Kieran set down the environment controller, adjusting its battered intake valve until the interior temperature rose a few degrees. Alir, wincing from bending her back, attempted to arrange hull scraps and fallen rock chunks into a rudimentary barricade near the entrance. Though pride made her refuse assistance, Kieran could see each movement taxed her injured legs. Her respiration quickened, pupils narrowing as waves of pain rippled through her. Without waiting for protest, he gently guided her to rest on a smooth rock shelf along the wall. "You need to recover. Let me handle this." She gave him a flinty glare, opening her mouth to retort. Instead, she exhaled and allowed him to strap on a repurposed brace around her hips and lower spine. It was a partial exoskeleton he'd rigged from the Dracoth armor plating. While not perfect, it offered supportive pressure to keep her spine aligned. "Engineering has many disciplines," Kieran murmured in wry explanation, "including improvising medical gear." Alir's lips lifted in an almost smile, equal parts gratitude and discomfort. "Your resourcefulness grows more impressive. If only I directed it at the front lines instead of chaining you in the lower decks." There was a subtle regret in her tone, uncharacteristic of the proud queen. Kieran offered a small shrug. "We each have regrets, but that was then." He glanced at the rocky ceiling overhead, where veins of phosphorescent mineral glowed faintly. "Focus on surviving now." He resumed piling up barriers at the cave mouth. Outside, the alien sun blazed across the jagged fields, and the wind carried distant howls. In time, both of them collapsed into a tense, guarded rest, well aware that they were one skirmish away from oblivion. Yet for the moment, they occupied the same fragile sanctuary, sharing weary glances that hinted at an alliance deeper than forced necessity, an alliance that might hold the seeds of something neither had expected to find. 2 days slipped by in the rugged cavern, each marked by cautious foraging, makeshift medicine, and restless nights spent warding off prowling beasts. During that time, an unspoken accord settled between Alir and Kieran, as if the tentative bond they'd forged in crisis was steadily crystallizing into genuine partnership. Yet survival alone would not suffice, especially for Alir. She was no wanderer meant to languish on a forsaken planet. She was an imperial queen bound by the oaths and obligations of her people. Whenever Kieran caught her gaze drifting across the stony walls, he glimpsed simmering determination beneath her calm exterior. If she stayed here too long, the Empire might mistakenly believe her truly dead, and the real villains behind this sabotage would thrive unchallenged. Late into the second night, Kieran busied himself reworking one of the Dracoth scanners, rigging it to interface with the buttered environment controller. "If I can amplify the range," he muttered, "maybe we can spot a functioning fragment of the Sunstrider's legacy with a comm array, or at least a small rescue beacon." He worked under the glow of a faint crystal chunk they'd chipped from deeper in the cavern. Its natural luminescence provided enough light to see by, but painted their shelter in hues of ghostly blue. Eilir, recovering strength daily, had managed to limber her stiff tail and stretch her traumatized spine. With Kieran's improvised brace, she now walked short distances on her own. She limped toward him, stopping just a pace away. For a moment, neither spoke. The hush was broken only by the hum of the environment controller. In the uncertain closeness, Kieran recalled the ragged anger that once flared in her eyes whenever she looked his way. But now his chest tightened not from fear, but from the gravity of her presence. The wariness was still there, overshadowed by something gentler. Respect, curiosity, and a mutual, if reluctant, admiration. "You're scanning for a comm device," she said, voice subdued. "But suppose we find one and my own people arrive. Your life might be forfeit." That statement hung between them, colder than the subterranean air. The Dracoths, after all, had enslaved humans on more than a dozen worlds, and Kieran had directly defied the chain of command, inadvertently crashing the Empire's prize flagship. Kieran offered a lopsided shrug, better than slowly starving, or getting torn apart by six-legged monsters. His hands never ceased their careful recalibration of wires and circuits. Besides, maybe I'm done being afraid. You're not exactly as I expected, Alir. He dared to speak her name plainly. She studied him with those gleaming silver eyes, the faint ridges near her temples shifting. A Dracoth sign of earnest thought. You risk everything, even your freedom. She exhaled, the rustling whisper of her scaled chest betraying deep internal conflict. There was a time I would have used that loyalty against you, but too much has changed. So have I. Lightning flickered in the distant sky, flashing through cracks in the cavern ceiling. In that flicker, Kieran caught the determined set of her jaw, the renewed spark that signaled the Queen's will to reclaim her throne. Let's finish scanning, she said. We have more battles ahead than just this wilderness. Kieran nodded and returned to his work, yet he couldn't shake the electric current that passed between them. They were no longer just a captive engineer and the imperious monarch who had enslaved him. They were a team, forging a precarious trust under the watchful eyes of an unknown planet. By dawn of the next day, Kieran's tireless labor bore fruit. The augmented scanner emitted a triumphant chirp, pinpointing an intact communications node within a large fragment of the Sunstrider's legacy, several kilometers north. Though partially buried near a rocky escarpment, the node might still have the power to transmit a distress signal. The potential for rescue was real, and with it, a looming threat. If that signal reached the wrong Dracoths, the traitors could send a kill squad to silence Alir for good. Still, there was no turning back. Equipped with salvage packs, sharpened spears of Dracoth alloy, and a single energy pistol with 2 remaining charges, they set off. Alir moved with increasing confidence, her black and indigo scales regaining some lustrous sheen. Though each step cost her stamina, she clenched her jaw and refused to show weakness. Now and then, she allowed Kieran to offer a stabilizing arm when the ground grew especially treacherous. As they navigated a maze of jagged rock columns, they discussed the ambush that had brought them here. Alir recounted her final memory. The klaxon of proximity alarms, the bewildering codes the enemy ships had used to bypass standard detection. It pointed to an inside job. I have a cousin, she said quietly, named Lysandros, known for his ambition. He and others on my war council believe the Empire should exterminate, not just enslave, humankind. I refused because complete genocide is too costly, too pointless. That may have driven him to orchestrate my downfall. Kieran listened, his expression darkening at the mention of mass extermination. He remembered the ravaged cities of Earth, the millions who had perished. Yet from Alir's words, he gleaned a flicker of her deeper convictions. She wasn't the merciless tyrant he had imagined, but a ruler tempered by strategic thinking, possibly even a sense of moral boundary. If Lysandros is behind this, you'll be walking into a hornet's nest, he said. He'll have had time to consolidate power. Alir's tail lashed once, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. If I remain absent, the Empire will assume I'm dead. But if I return without evidence of his treachery, he'll label me a coward or a pretender. We need proof, and we need allies. They pressed onward. The terrain sloped into a network of shallow ravines lined with more of those translucent crystal growths. Surveying the path, Kieran spotted movement, skittering shapes lurking at the ravine's edges. He tensed, raising his spear as a precaution. One wrong step, and a pack of scavengers could swarm. Alir responded with calm professionalism, scanning the perimeter with her predator's eye. They're circling, testing our weaknesses. But the creatures never attacked outright. Instead, they followed at a cautious distance, as though sensing the lethal steel in Alir's glare and the unwavering confidence in Kieran's stance. When the ravine opened onto a plateau, the watchers melted back into the crystals. Relieved, the pair climbed a final ridge, hoping to catch sight of their target. Before them lay a broad depression in the planet's surface, littered with twisted scraps of the crashed flagship. Smoke still curled from some sections, though at this distance, it was hard to gauge the damage. Kieran's scanner beeped, pinpointing the communications fragment near the crater's center. It was time to push forward once more, balancing hope of rescue against the peril of discovery by Dracoth conspirators. Crouched behind a broken dorsal fin from the Sunstrider's legacy, they surveyed the crater. The communications array was entangled in a mess of fused paneling and crumpled conduits, half buried under blackened earth. In better days, that node had the capacity to broadcast Imperial commands across the entire star system. Now it lay battered like everything else. Even so, the scanner insisted there was enough functionality left to emit a short-range signal, if they could power it. Alir motioned for Kieran to stay low, sliding forward to examine the crater's perimeter with her keen Dracoth eyesight. Then, with a grimace, she gestured him closer. Peering over the ridge, Kieran's heart lurched. 4 armed Dracoth soldiers in dark Imperial gear patrolled the wreckage. These were no random survivors. Their posture was too vigilant, their uniforms bearing the crest of the 8th Legion, Lysandros' loyal force, if Alir's intelligence was correct. How did they find us? Kieran whispered. Alir's lips curled, revealing pointed fangs. Likely they tracked residual signals, or Lysandros dispatched them to confirm my corpse. They'll be thorough. She flexed her claws. We can't let them destroy that comm node. It might be our one hope of contacting loyalists. After a brief strategic huddle, the plan took shape. Kieran would circle around the far side of the crater, using the scattered debris as cover, aiming to reach the node undetected. Alir, still not at full combat strength, but formidable nonetheless, would create a distraction. They know me, she said quietly, her eyes dark with intent. One glimpse of the dead queen should rattle them. Stealth came naturally to Kieran after years in the human resistance. He slid between wreckage pieces, each footstep calculated, every breath measured. Now and then he risked a glance at the Dracoth patrol. They moved in pairs, scanning the crater's edges with discipline. One soldier paused near a collapsed console, tail swishing. Kieran pressed himself flat against a shattered thruster. He dared not move until the soldier continued on. Meanwhile, Alir calmly exited her hiding place, stepping into plain view across the crater. Even from a distance, Kieran heard the startled exclamations of the soldiers. The queen? Impossible! Alir's stance was commanding, shoulders back, tail raised. Although her injuries had robbed her of some physical fluidity, her aura of regality remained intact. She was no timid fugitive. Lower your weapons, her voice echoed. I am Queen Alir. You stand on Imperial territory and answer to me. Kieran smirked despite himself, proud of her sheer audacity. He used the soldier's confusion to slip behind a half-shredded corridor segment, inching closer to the communications node. One Dracoth raised his rifle, uncertain. We were told. You were told lies, Alir snapped, letting her voice ring with the imperious timbre that once commanded entire fleets. Stand down and you may yet live. The tension in the crater was palpable. As the patrol reeled from shock, two of them aimed energy rifles at her. A third soldier, less rattled, barked an order to sweep the perimeter. That was Kieran's cue. He darted forward, vaulting over twisted metal, heart pounding. He could see the half-buried node now, partly intact. Just beyond it, a single guard patrolled, scanning for intruders. If the guard spotted him, all was lost. Kieran braced himself against the broken plating, waiting for the perfect moment to spring. Meanwhile, across the crater, the queen confronted her would-be killers with unbroken resolve. A shout rang out, echoing off the crater walls. She's injured! Move in! One of the Dracoth soldiers noticed Alir's slight limp, launching a coordinated advance with his unit. Energy blasts ripped across the ground, scorching the gritty surface. Alir retaliated with a fierce lunge, unsheathing a short Dracoth blade Kieran had scavenged for her. She dodged awkwardly at the last second, her compromised spine limiting her fluidity, but her timing still lethal. Her blade drew a vivid slash across the nearest soldier's arm. He howled, stumbling back in pain. The thunderous exchange provided Kieran his opening. The guard near the node swiveled, drawn by the commotion behind him. Kieran sprang from cover, grappling him in a swift, desperate maneuver. Though physically smaller, Kieran used momentum and surprise to topple the guard. They crashed against the twisted metal, the guard's rifle firing into empty air. Before the Dracoth could recover, Kieran drove his improvised blade into a vulnerable gap in the soldier's armor plating. A hiss of hot breath escaped the guard's scaled lips. He went limp. Panting, Kieran quickly crouched by the communications node. Its outer casing was warped, so he wrenched it open, exposing a snarl of wires and half-fried circuits. Come on, he whispered, rummaging for the power couplings. They were battered but intact enough to accept the portable cell he carried. Sparks flew as he jury-rigged the connection. Across the crater, Alir battled in vicious bursts. She blocked a rifle butt aimed at her torso and countered with a slash toward the Dracoth's thigh. Another soldier fired from behind, forcing her to duck behind a chunk of hull. Smoke rose from scorched armor near her shoulder, telling Kieran she'd been grazed. Fury churned in his gut at the sight. But he couldn't abandon the node. If they couldn't call for help, neither of them would live long. A sudden beep indicated the node had some measure of power. Kieran thumbed the ignition switch, hoping the frequency crystals were still aligned. A static crackle answered. Yes, he breathed. We have a signal. He only had seconds to choose who might receive it. If he set it to the Universal Distress Channel, Lysandros' traitorous forces might intercept. He needed a secure code, one that loyal Dracoths in the Empire might recognize as legit. Recalling Alir's personal encryption key from his time in her engineering deck, Kieran tapped a sequence on the battered panel, a string of digits that spelled out a coded fragment of her royal name. The node word, broadcasting on a narrowband frequency. He could only pray that someone loyal was listening. With that done, he snatched up the guard's energy rifle. Time to back up Alir. Rising from behind the node, he aimed carefully at the Dracoth soldier pinning her down. Before the warrior could shift position, Kieran squeezed the trigger. A lance of green energy tore across the crater, striking the assailant's flank. He roared in agony and collapsed. Alir turned, silver eyes locking onto Kieran's for an instant, a wordless exchange of gratitude and determination. Yet the fight wasn't over. Two more Dracoths advanced. Their predicament was dire, and the node's distress call might be their only hope. Forward! Bellowed one of the soldiers, firing a volley of plasma bolts that hissed and sparkled around Alir. She hissed in return, deflecting one shot with a battered chunk of hull. Kieran rushed from cover, rifle raised. Another soldier, anticipating his move, swiveled to engage. The soldier's next blast missed Kieran's head by a hair. Searing heat prickled across his cheek. Unwilling to hesitate, he pulled the trigger. One well-placed bolt took the Dracoth in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. Alir, meanwhile, closed in on the final combatant, a scar-faced warrior who recognized his queen but refused to yield. He aimed his rifle right at her chest. In that split second, she drew upon the last reserves of her agility, ducking beneath the muzzle. Her tail lashed out, hooking behind the soldier's knee. He stumbled, and her blade found its mark across his torso with ruthless precision. With a final hiss, the scar-faced warrior crumpled. The crater went eerily quiet except for the crackling of small fires. 4 Dracoth attackers lay on the ground, 2 dead, 2 unconscious, or gravely wounded. Alir sagged to one knee, pressing a trembling claw to her newly singed shoulder. Even from a distance, Kieran could see the pain etched into her features. He rushed to her side, scanning for further threats. The node beeped intermittently in the background, broadcasting the coded signal. "We did it," he breathed, kneeling next to her. Blood trickled from a gash on her temple, mixing with the dust. She nodded, but her eyes were clouded with fatigue. "For the moment," she replied, voice taut. "Help me up." He helped her stand, gingerly supporting her uninjured arm. "That broadcast, did you manage to lock in my encryption?" she asked. Kieran nodded. "Yes, but I have no idea if anyone loyal heard it. The range is limited." A faint crackle from the node spun their heads around. Through the battered speaker, a distorted voice emerged, shaped by static. "Repeat, receiving partial code. Identify your location." Hope flared in Alir's expression. She half limped, half ran to the console. "This is Queen Alir," she said, leaning on the node's battered microphone. "We've crashed on planet Vraxir 4. My crew is lost or compromised. Respond if you are sworn to the crown." A tense pause followed, making Kieran fear the broadcast had fizzled. Then came a rushed reply. "Your Majesty, this is Commander Syrian, loyal to the throne. Stand by for rescue." Relief flooded Kieran's chest, mirrored in Alir's shaky exhale. The battered queen closed her eyes, steadying herself. "Syrian," she murmured into the mic. "Approach with caution. Traitors roam these skies. We have casualties." "Understood, Your Majesty." "Stay safe." The line went quiet. Even that curt exchange was enough to lift a monumental weight from both survivors. Rescue was coming, an end, or at least a turning point, in this nightmare. But it also meant a collision course with the Empire's internal strife. If Syrian was trustworthy, they could rally. If not, they could be walking into a trap. Kieran placed a hand on Alir's good shoulder. "We need to secure the area," he said quietly, motioning to the wounded Dracoths who were stirring feebly. Alir nodded grimly. Dealing with them was grim work. She couldn't allow them to rearm and ambush Syrian's team. She knelt by one, a female soldier who clutched a deep slash in her armor. "I serve Lysandros," the soldier gasped. "He told us you were unfit to rule." Alir's jaw clenched, but her voice remained controlled. "He lies. Spread that truth if you live." Without further cruelty, she stripped the soldiers' weapons and ammo. Kieran did the same for the others, albeit with noticeable unease. Then, side by side, they hobbled away from the crater's center, waiting under the partial cover of a fallen wing. It was as defensible a position as any. Their hearts pounded with the same urgent rhythm, bracing for the uncertain arrival of Alir's purported allies. They didn't have to wait long. Less than an hour later, the roar of engines vibrated the alien sky. Out of the roiling clouds swooped a sleek corvette bearing the Queen's official insignia, a stylized star encircled by draconic wings. A ramp lowered, and a squad of Dracoths in polished armor rushed onto the battlefield, fanning out in defensive formation. Their leader, a tall, copper-scaled officer, advanced cautiously. Alir recognized him at once. "Syrian," she called, stepping from behind the debris with Kieran at her side. The officer's eyes lit with stunned relief. "Your Majesty," he breathed, crossing one arm over his chest in a loyal salute. "We received your code. We feared the worst." He escorted them up the ramp, ordering medics to attend to Alir's injuries. A wave of tension rolled off Kieran when none of the Dracoths drew weapons on him. Alir nodded to the medics, but refused the stretcher they offered, insisting on standing. She was battered, bleeding, but unbroken. "We must leave at once," she said, voice resonating with authority again. "Lysandros or others loyal to him will hunt us if they realize I still live." Syrian bowed his head. "Your Majesty, we learned only pieces of the truth. Rumors of sabotage, of a queen lost in battle. But the imperial court has fallen into disarray, with Lysandros seizing power as regent. He claims he acts on behalf of the absent queen." A flicker of rage ignited in Alir's silver eyes. "He's no regent. He's a traitor." She glanced at Kieran, a silent question in her gaze. "Are we ready for this next fight?" Kieran squeezed her hand in response. "Let's finish it," he whispered. Within minutes, the corvette ascended, leaving the scorching wreckage of the Sunstrider's legacy behind. Alir and Kieran found themselves in the medical bay, ringed by anxious Dracoth attendants. They dabbed antiseptic across Alir's burns, checking the brace on her spine. Kieran watched warily, half expecting a betrayal at any moment. Centuries of oppression had taught humans never to trust Dracoth authority. But Syrian and his team treated both of them with professional courtesy. Sometime later, Alir emerged from the medbay with renewed vigor, bandaged but resolute. She found Kieran in a corridor, turning a battered Dracoth pistol over in his hands, lost in thought. "We're en route to the capital," she informed him, standing close enough that he felt the warmth radiating from her scales. "Syrian says Lysandros controls the palace guard, but he believes many will remain loyal to the rightful queen if we confront him publicly." "Publicly?" Kieran repeated. He swallowed hard, thinking of the Empire's grand halls, its population in the billions, and the deep-seated animosity toward humans. "You're betting on a big risk." A soft, almost weary smile touched her lips. "All rulership is a risk. I accepted that when I ascended the throne. But you—" She reached out, claws sliding gently against his shoulder. "You're risking everything too. My people, they are not always merciful." Kieran squared his shoulders. "If there's any chance to prevent more slaughter, I'll take it. I'm tired of letting fear and hate rule our worlds." Her gaze lingered on him. For the first time, the stoic Dracoth queen looked almost vulnerable, as if acknowledging the bond that had blossomed in the crucible of that hostile planet. "Then let's change the Empire," she said quietly. Soon the capital's silhouette appeared through the corvette's viewports, towering citadels that glowed red beneath a setting sun. Shadows crept across the spired skyline, symbolizing the turmoil Alir would soon face. Steeling themselves, they prepared to land, hearts pounding with the realization that the final reckoning was at hand. The grand palace of Dracoth civilization stood in regal magnificence, built from gleaming obsidian stone and ornate metal filigrees. Two imposing statues of ancient draconic heroes flanked the main entrance, carved with such detail that they seemed poised to spring to life. Yet inside, the corridors had turned into a nest of intrigue. Guard patrols marched tensely, eyes flicking from shadow to shadow. Servants whispered of the regent's new decrees, expanding forced labor quotas, issuing veiled threats to subjugated worlds. No formal announcement preceded Alir's arrival. Flanked by Syrian's loyal soldiers, she strode through the vaulted main doors, each step echoing across the polished obsidian floor. Kieran followed a half-step behind, clutching a small data crystal that recorded the sabotage logs from the crashed flagship. Overhead, banner after banner bore the crest of the Empire, an empire now balanced on a razor's edge between tyranny and transformation. The throne room was a cavernous hall. Braziers lined the walls, casting flickering light on tall pillars, etched with images of Dracoth conquests. At the far end, on a raised dais, sat Lysandros, draped in ceremonial robes, flanked by heavily armed guards. He froze the instant he caught sight of Alir, his copper scales bristling. A murmur of shock rippled through the gathered crowd. Nobles, military officers, and bureaucrats who had apparently assembled for a formal address by the so-called regent. For a moment, absolute silence reigned. Then Lysandros stood, attempting a sneer of affected calm. "Impossible. The queen perished in an ambush beyond our borders." His gaze flicked to Kieran, brimming with contempt at the sight of a human so close to royal presence. Alir's voice thundered through the hall. "You dare speak falsehoods in the imperial seat? I live, and your conspiracy stands exposed." She pointed one clawed finger, scales glinting under the brazier light. "Seize him," she commanded, turning to the palace guard. "Or do you forget your loyalty?" Some guards shifted uncertainly, while others tightened their grip on weapons. Lysandros spat venomous words. "Traitor queen! She's in league with humans to undermine our empire." He turned to the crowd. "She'd see our dominion slip away, all in the name of mercy for these lesser beings." An undercurrent of tension swelled. Kieran stepped forward, ignoring the stares of incredulity. He raised the data crystal. These logs, pulled from the Sunstrider's legacy, prove Lysandros compromised the flagship's security codes to orchestrate the ambush. Read them yourself. Queen Aelir's orders were systematically overridden, all so he could claim power. A hush fell. Even among Dracoth aristocrats, the evidence of sabotage against the Empire's supreme vessel was no trifling matter. Several elder advisors exchanged hushed whispers. A growing murmur of outrage and confusion spread. Lysandros' copper face twisted in desperation, seeing the tide shift. He lunged toward Aelir with a concealed dagger, roaring a final bid for control. But Aelir was ready, stepping aside with that refined Dracoth agility. The palace guard, spurred by the queen's presence, surged in. Syrian's loyalists pinned Lysandros, wresting the dagger from his grasp. His last defiant scream reverberated. "We should never bow to weakness! We must exterminate them all!" Panting, Aelir glared down at him, her chest heaving with suppressed fury. "You see only conquest," she said, voice trembling with suppressed pain and conviction. "Yet dominion without conscience is hollow. You've betrayed the Empire's honor. For that, there can be no mercy." Lysandros was hauled away, his supporters' courage evaporating in the face of the queen's righteous anger. In the stunned aftermath, the crowd gradually knelt to Aelir, saluting in renewed allegiance. She ascended the dais, though not by flight nor regal triumph, but with a resolute limp that symbolized the trials she'd survived. Turning to face the assembly, she exhaled a shaky breath. "Our empire will not crumble," she proclaimed, voice echoing across the throne room. "It will evolve. We stand at a crossroads. We can choose fear and endless bloodshed, or we can unite. Humans, Dracoths, and every species we once subjugated. From this day, I decree a new path, one forged by mutual respect and shared strength." Her gaze flicked to Kieran, who stood among the assembled Dracoths without shackles or fear. Their eyes met in silent acknowledgement of a future unthinkable weeks before. He inclined his head, acceptance and quiet pride mingling in his expression. And so, at the heart of a palace once defined by conquest, a wounded queen and the human who refused to abandon her lit the first sparks of a reimagined empire. An empire no longer shaped solely by might, but guided by the fragile, powerful bond they had proven possible. From my vantage, the journey of Queen Aelir and Kieran is a testament to hope in the midst of hardship. Their willingness to trust one another, despite centuries of enmity, transforms anger and suspicion into a powerful force for change. We watch them battle monstrous predators, navigate political schemes, and ultimately reshape an empire, once defined by cruelty, into one guided by unity and shared purpose. It's a reminder that our own struggles can become stepping stones toward empathy and renewal. I personally found inspiration in their resourcefulness and resilience, and I hope you did too. What moments resonated most with you? Did their alliance spark thoughts on forgiveness or cooperation in the face of oppression? Let's discuss in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspectives and theories about the future of Aelir's realm. Together, let's keep exploring what it means to defy expectations and shape a brighter tomorrow.